December, the season of frosty nights, warm lights, and festive cheer. But beneath the twinkling holiday glow lies a darkness, a cold, creeping fear that only grows as the nights get longer. Tonight we're diving into 6 disturbing true December horror stories. These are not tales from a distant land or made-up fantasies. These are real experiences from real people, and they'll make you think twice about the cozy comforts of the season. But before we dive into these chilling accounts, I need you to do one thing. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the most spine-tingling stories we share. Smash that like button if you love a good scare, and drop the name of your city in the comments below, because you never know, your town might just be the setting of our next true horror story. Our first story begins on a lonely December night. The snow fell gently, covering the ground like a soft, white blanket. But as one man sat in his cabin, watching the storm rage outside, the flickering lights signaled something far more sinister. Something waiting for him in the dark. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, a chance to escape the chaos of the city and find some peace in a remote cabin for a few days before the holidays. Ben had grown tired of the crowded streets and endless noise of urban life. He longed for solitude, fresh air, and the serenity of nature. So when he stumbled upon a secluded cabin in the mountains, he thought it was the perfect solution. Nestled deep in the woods, far from any neighbors, it was the ideal place to unplug and recharge. The cabin was rustic, charming in its own way, with heavy wooden beams and a large stone fireplace that beckoned for cozy nights by the fire. Ben didn't mind the fact that the cabin was a bit old, with creaky floors and faded wallpaper that told tales of generations past. It had character, and that's all that mattered to him. The owner had warned him about the harsh winter ahead and suggested that he bring plenty of supplies. But Ben was used to the cold. He figured he'd be fine. As night fell and the snow began to fall gently outside, Ben lit the fire, set up a few candles around the room, and settled into an armchair with a book. The crackling flames and the quiet of the wilderness were exactly what he had been yearning for. The outside world felt like a distant memory, far beyond the reach of his thoughts. But then, it happened. As Ben began to read, the lights in the cabin flickered, a soft, almost imperceptible dimming that caught his attention. At first, he thought it was a malfunction. Perhaps the storm was causing power surges. He shrugged it off and returned to his book. But moments later, the lights flickered again. This time, the dimming lasted a little longer, and a faint buzzing sound accompanied it. Ben frowned and glanced up, puzzled. He got up and walked over to the light switch, flicking it on and off a few times. The light seemed fine, but when he turned back around to sit down, he saw something strange, an unnatural shadow in the corner of the room. It was tall and thin, stretching unnaturally across the wall. Ben's heart skipped a beat as he turned to face the shadow, but when he blinked, it was gone. The room was empty. Confused and unnerved, Ben returned to his chair. He tried to shake off the feeling that something wasn't quite right. He glanced at the clock. Almost midnight. That's when he heard it. A faint humming sound, almost like a voice, but too distorted to make out. It seemed to come from the walls, from behind the fireplace, as though something or someone was whispering, just out of reach. Ben felt a chill race down his spine. He stood up quickly, heart pounding, and checked the windows. The storm was picking up outside, the snow swirling in a furious dance. But it wasn't just the weather that unnerved him. It was the feeling of being watched, a sensation that grew stronger by the second. The humming grew louder. Ben could no longer ignore it. It wasn't just a trick of the wind. It was real, and it was coming from somewhere inside the cabin. His eyes darted around, searching for the source. But the cabin remained still, nothing out of place, except for the oppressive air that had settled over the room. He walked cautiously towards the kitchen, hoping to find some sort of explanation. As he passed the doorframe, the lights flickered again. This time, the entire room plunged into darkness. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Ben froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his phone. But when he turned the screen on, it was dead. The battery had been full when he arrived, but now there was no charge at all. He cursed under his breath and fumbled for a flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but as it swept across the room, he noticed something terrifying. Fresh footprints appeared in the snow outside the window. The strange thing was, they only led up to the cabin door. There were no footprints leading away, no signs of anyone leaving. The room felt colder, and the air seemed to thicken, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on him. Panic surged in his chest, and he hurried to lock the front door. But when he turned around, the humming had stopped. Instead, there was a soft, almost imperceptible scratching sound, like fingernails dragging against the wall. Ben's breath caught in his throat. He spun around, shining the flashlight on the walls, but there was nothing. The scratching had stopped, but the atmosphere felt suffocating, and he could barely bring himself to move. He sat down on the couch, trying to gather his thoughts. He needed to calm down. This was just his imagination, he told himself. There was nothing in this cabin except him. Nothing. Except for the strange feeling that the room had changed. The temperature had dropped. The fire in the hearth crackled, but it couldn't fight the cold creeping into the room. And that's when he saw it. Something in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. It looked like a figure, standing motionless in the shadows, watching him. Ben stood up abruptly, his heart hammering in his chest. The figure didn't move, but he knew it was there. He could feel its presence, like a cold wind brushing against his skin. The next few days were a blur of sleepless nights and growing unease. Ben tried to rationalize everything, tried to convince himself that the strange occurrences were nothing more than his mind playing tricks on him, magnified by the isolation and the harsh winter. But it was impossible to ignore what was happening. The lights continued to flicker at odd intervals, always in sync with his own voice. Every time he spoke aloud, they dimmed. He tried talking to himself, testing the theory, but the pattern remained. The lights responded to his words, like something or someone was listening. Objects began to move. Small things at first. A chair that wasn't where he'd left it. A glass that seemed to slide off the counter when he wasn't looking. But then it escalated. The mirrors started to warp, showing reflections that didn't match reality. His own face would look back at him with a twisted smile, or his movements would lag behind his actual action, as if he wasn't alone in the room. Ben knew something was wrong. Something sinister was in this cabin with him. But what? That night, as the storm raged outside, he found the answer in an old journal left behind by the cabin's previous occupants. It belonged to a man named William, who had lived here with his family years ago. The journal detailed strange happenings, noises, shadows, and unexplained events. But the most disturbing part was a single line that sent a shiver down Ben's spine. The watchers are always listening. Ben's search for answers led him to the local town. There, he met an elderly man who claimed to know the cabin's history. The man was hesitant at first, but eventually told Ben the chilling truth. The cabin was built on cursed land, a place where tragic events had occurred over the years. According to the town's legends, those who lived there were never truly alone. The land was haunted by the Watchers, malevolent spirits that lingered, waiting for new souls to claim. When Ben returned to the cabin, he found more than just strange occurrences. The spirits of the vanished family began to appear in the mirrors, their eyes hollow and vacant. The scratching sounds on the walls became louder, more frantic. The shadow in the corner grew darker, more defined. He realized with horror that the spirits weren't just watching him, they were trying to take him. The storm reached its peak that night, and Ben was trapped inside. The lights went out completely, and the whispers of the watchers grew deafening. The walls seemed to close in on him as the spirits reached out, clawing at him from the shadows. He could feel their cold fingers brushing against his skin, pulling him toward the darkness. In a panic, Ben ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The spirits were closing in, their voices louder now, filling his mind with their chilling demands. His only choice was to fight back. Grabbing an old fireplace poker, he swung it wildly at the shadows, but it passed through them, doing nothing to stop their advance. The door finally opened, and Ben bolted into the blizzard, desperate to escape. But when he looked back, the cabin was gone. The snow-covered land stretched endlessly, and he realized with a jolt of terror that he was standing in the exact same spot he had started from. The Watchers were still there, and they had no intention of letting him go. Ben woke up in the hospital, surrounded by doctors and police officers. They told him he had been found unconscious in the woods days after he had disappeared, with no memory of how he got there. But Ben knew what had happened. The spirits had let him escape, but just barely. When he returned to the cabin to gather his things, the lights flickered once more. The watchers were still waiting. Emma had always loved the holiday season. The twinkling lights, the sound of cheerful carols, and the bustling excitement of shoppers preparing for Christmas filled her with joy. This year, she decided to give back to her community by volunteering as a Salvation Army bell ringer. Standing outside a busy department store downtown, she felt proud to play her part in spreading holiday cheer. The first few days were uneventful. People smiled politely, dropped spare change into the red kettle, and went about their day. But by the end of the first week, Emma noticed something strange. A man in a tattered coat standing across the street. He didn't shop, talk to anyone, or even seem to move. He simply stood there, staring at her. At first, she thought he was just a passerby, or a homeless man seeking warmth, but something about him unsettled her. His eyes never left her. No matter how many hours she rang the bell, he stayed, and when her shift ended, he was gone. The next day, Emma took her place by the kettle. The streets were alive with the buzz of holiday shoppers, their faces bright with excitement despite the chilly December air. Emma tried to brush off her unease from the day before, but as the hours ticked by, she saw him again, the man in the tattered coat. He stood in the exact same spot across the street staring at her. His face was pale, and his eyes seemed hollow, like twin voids that drew her gaze no matter how hard she tried to ignore him. This time she waved. Maybe he was just lonely and wanted someone to acknowledge him, but he didn't wave back. He didn't smile or nod. He simply stood there, unmoving. A woman passing by noticed Emma's discomfort. "You okay, dear?" she asked kindly. Emma hesitated. "Yeah, do you see that man across the street?" The woman looked, then frowned. "What man?" Emma turned back, but the man was gone. Over the next few days, the man appeared during each of Emma's shifts. He never spoke or approached her, but his presence felt heavy, oppressive. She started to dread going to her post, though she couldn't explain why. One night, as she was packing up to leave, she heard the faint sound of a bell ringing behind her. Turning, she saw the man standing just a few feet away, his tattered coat swaying slightly in the wind. "How can I help you?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. The man tilted his head, his lips curling into a strange smile. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of an alley. Emma's heart pounded. She decided to tell her supervisor, but when she described the man, her supervisor's face went pale. "You're not the first to see him," he said quietly. "Years ago, a volunteer disappeared after mentioning a man like that. They never found him." Emma couldn't shake the man's presence. At night, she dreamt of him, standing at the foot of her bed, ringing his bells softly. In the dream, the sound grew louder and louder, until it felt like it was inside her head, drowning out her thoughts. She began to research. What she found sent chills down her spine. Decades ago, a man named Henry had been a Salvation Army bell ringer in the same city. He was known for his dedication, working long hours even in the harshest weather. But one bitterly cold Christmas Eve, Henry had collapsed while ringing his bell. By the time anyone found him, it was too late. He'd frozen to death. Legend had it that Henry's spirit lingered, drawn to those who took up his role. Some said he was harmless, a ghost bound by his love for the cause. But others claimed he was jealous, seeking to replace the living so he could continue his work. Emma decided to confront the man during her next shift. She wanted answers, even if they terrified her. As she rang the bell, she felt his presence before she saw him. The air grew colder, and the usual holiday cheer around her seemed to fade, as if the world had been muted. He was there, across the street, staring at her with those hollow eyes. Emma gripped the bell tightly and called out, "What do you want?" To her shock, the man began to walk toward her. His movements were slow, deliberate, and unnatural, as if his body didn't quite belong to this world. The closer he got, the louder her bell seemed to ring, though she wasn't moving her hand. "Stop!" she shouted, but he didn't. When he was just a few feet away, he spoke for the first time. His voice was cold, distant, and layered with an eerie echo. "You've taken my place." Before Emma could react, he lunged at her. She screamed, dropping the bell as his icy hands closed around her wrist. The world around her seemed to vanish, replaced by darkness and the deafening sound of ringing bells. With a burst of adrenaline, she broke free and ran, leaving the kettle and the man behind. She didn't stop until she reached her car. Emma quit her role the next day, but the experience left her shaken. Even after the holidays ended, she couldn't escape the sound of bells. They rang in her dreams, echoed faintly in the distance, and sometimes, when she was alone, she swore she could hear them inside her home. Months later, while walking downtown, she passed by another bell ringer. The sound froze her in her tracks. Slowly, she turned to look. Across the street, standing in the same spot where he had always been, was the man in the tattered coat. His hollow eyes met hers, and he smiled. Emma realized then that she would never be free. The bell ringer wasn't just a ghost, he was a curse, bound to her for as long as she lived. It was December, the most magical time of the year, or at least, that's what everyone told Ethan. Fresh out of college and desperate for work, Ethan had recently taken a job as a security guard at an old church in his small New England hometown. The building was massive, its towering steeple casting long shadows over the snow-covered streets. It was a historic landmark, built in the late 1800s, and was said to have one of the most beautiful pipe organs in the state. Ethan's job was simple: patrol the premises, lock up at night, and make sure nothing went wrong. He didn't mind the quiet. The church had an eerie stillness after dark, but it was peaceful in its way, or so he thought. The trouble began his second week on the job. One night, as he made his rounds, he heard faint music drifting through the empty halls. It was a hauntingly beautiful melody, soft and mournful, like a lullaby played on the organ. But Ethan knew he was the only one in the church. The next night, Ethan arrived early for his shift. He decided to investigate the sound, convinced it was just an old quirk of the building. Perhaps the wind was passing through the pipes, creating the illusion of music. At first, everything seemed normal. The pews were empty, the stained glass windows glimmered faintly in the moonlight, and the organ stood silent at the front of the church. But as Ethan walked closer to the organ, he noticed something odd. The keys were pressed down, as if someone had been playing it. A chill ran down his spine. He hadn't seen anyone enter the church, and he was sure he'd locked the doors. Deciding not to overthink it, he brushed it off and continued his rounds. But as the hours passed, the music returned. This time, it wasn't faint. It was loud, filling the entire church with a somber hymn. Ethan rushed to the organ, expecting to find someone there. But the bench was empty. The keys moved on their own, each note striking with eerie precision. He backed away slowly, his heart pounding, but the music stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The silence that followed was almost worse, heavy and oppressive. Ethan felt like he was being watched. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences escalated. It wasn't just the organ anymore. Ethan began hearing whispers, soft and indistinct, echoing through the halls. The candles in the sanctuary would flicker and extinguish on their own, leaving him in total darkness. One night, as he was locking up, Ethan heard a low hum coming from the choir loft. Against his better judgment, he climbed the narrow staircase to investigate. The loft was empty, but the sound grew louder, resonating in his ears like a vibrating string. Then he saw them. Dozens of shadowy figures stood in the pews below, their forms barely visible in the dim light. They were motionless, their heads bowed as if in prayer. Ethan froze, unable to move or even breathe. And then, as one, they turned to look at him. Their faces were pale and featureless, their eyes nothing more than dark hollows. Ethan stumbled backward, nearly falling down the stairs. But when he looked again, the figures were gone. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the church was hiding something. Determined to find answers, he began digging into its history. He discovered that the church had been home to a famous choir in the early 1900s. They were known for their angelic voices and had performed all over the country. But tragedy struck one bitter December night. During a rehearsal, a fire broke out in the sanctuary, trapping the choir inside. Despite efforts to save them, None of the members survived. Their bodies were found huddled together near the organ, their hands clasped in prayer. Rumors circulated that the choir's spirits never left the church. Some claimed to hear their voices during midnight masses, while others reported seeing shadowy figures in the pews. The organ was said to play on its own, echoing the final hymn they sang before their deaths. Ethan realized with growing dread that he had been witnessing their restless spirits. The final straw came on Christmas Eve. Ethan was assigned to work the late shift, even though he begged to be reassigned. As the clock struck midnight, the church seemed to come alive. The organ blared, the whispers turned into screams, and the temperature plummeted. Ethan ran to the sanctuary, intending to grab his things and leave, but he stopped dead in his tracks. The pews were filled with shadowy figures, their hollow eyes fixed on him. The organ played a frantic, discordant melody, and the shadows began to rise, floating toward him. Ethan tried to move, but his body was frozen, rooted to the spot. The air grew heavy, pressing down on his chest. One figure emerged from the others, taller and more defined. Its face was partially visible, charred and twisted. It raised a hand, pointing directly at Ethan. "Join us!" it rasped, its voice like crackling fire. Ethan mustered all his strength and bolted for the door. As he ran, the shadows followed, their whispers merging into a deafening roar. He burst into the cold night, collapsing in the snow. When he looked back, the church was silent and dark, as if nothing had happened. Ethan quit his job the next day, but the experience stayed with him. The church closed its doors permanently a few months later, citing structural issues, but Ethan knew the real reason. Even now, years later, he can't walk past a church without feeling the weight of those hollow eyes, and sometimes, in the quiet of the night, he swears he can hear the faint, mournful strains of an organ, playing a hymn only the dead would know. For 16-year-old Mia, the December snowstorm was both a blessing and a curse. It meant school was canceled for the week, giving her plenty of time to enjoy lazy mornings and hot cocoa. But it also meant her parents, busy running their bakery in town, left her home alone in their rural farmhouse for hours on end. The snowstorm was the worst in years, blanketing the landscape in an endless sea of white. The only signs of life were the occasional deer tracks in the snow and the distant chimneys puffing smoke into the frozen air. Mia spent her days watching holiday movies and scrolling through social media. But on the third day of the storm, boredom set in. Inspired by the nostalgic idea of building a snowman, she bundled up and headed outside. The first snowman was simple: two lumpy balls of snow stacked on top of each other, with sticks for arms and a carrot nose. She laughed at its crooked smile, but the frosty air bit at her cheeks, so she quickly retreated indoors. That night, Mia awoke to a soft thud against her bedroom window. Groggily, she got up and peeked through the frost-covered glass. The snowman stood exactly where she'd built it, only now it was facing her window. The next morning, Mia convinced herself she'd imagined it. The snowstorm had been relentless, and the wind could have shifted the snowman slightly. Laughing at her own paranoia, she decided to build another one, this time closer to the house. As she shaped the snow into its round body, Mia felt an odd sensation, like she was being watched. She glanced around, but there was no one, just the stillness of the snowy fields. That night, the thud came again, louder this time. Mia's heart raced as she looked out the window. The new snowman was there, but it wasn't alone. Standing next to it was another snowman, taller and leaner, its stick arms twisted into unnatural angles. Both were facing her window, their blank faces tilted upward as if staring directly at her. Mia's stomach churned. She hadn't built the second snowman. Mia told her parents about the snowmen when they returned from the bakery, but they laughed it off. "Maybe some kids from the next farm over are messing with you," her dad said. Determined not to let it scare her, Mia decided to destroy the snowmen. She trudged outside with a shovel and swung it at the first one. It crumbled easily, leaving nothing but a pile of snow. But when she turned to the second snowman, she froze. Its head had turned. Mia stumbled backward, dropping the shovel. The snowman stood motionless, its stick arms raised slightly, almost like it was reaching for her. She ran inside, locking the door behind her. That night, the noises grew louder. It wasn't just a thud anymore. It was scratching, like nails dragging across her window. When Mia finally mustered the courage to look, the snowman was back, fully rebuilt, and closer than before. Desperate for answers, Mia started digging through old newspapers in the attic, hoping to distract herself. Instead, she stumbled upon a faded headline: "Family disappears in snowstorm. Only snowmen found at scene." The article detailed a chilling story from 50 years ago. A family who lived in the same farmhouse vanished during a snowstorm, leaving behind strange, human-like snowmen in their yard. Neighbors claimed the snowmen appeared overnight, and each one was positioned as if they were watching the house. Mia's blood ran cold. The article mentioned no suspects and no explanations, just an ominous warning: beware what you build in the snow. That night, the snowmen multiplied. When Mia looked outside, she counted 4 now, all lined up in a row, their blank faces fixed on her bedroom window. The storm raged on as Mia's panic escalated. She tried calling her parents, but the phone lines were down, and her cell service was spotty at best. She decided to barricade the doors and windows, piling furniture against them in a desperate attempt to keep whatever was outside from getting in. But the scratching continued, growing louder and more frantic. Mia's heart pounded as she heard the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, trying the doorknob. Grabbing a flashlight and a kitchen knife, she crept toward the front door. Her breath fogged in the icy air as she peered through the peephole. The snowman was on the porch. Its stick arm was raised, pressing against the door, and its body seemed more defined, almost human. Mia screamed and backed away, tripping over a chair. The scratching stopped. Silence hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. Then from behind her, she heard the soft crunch of snow. Mia spun around, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Standing in the living room was a snowman, its features more grotesque than ever. Its stick arms twitched, and its hollow eyes seemed to bore into her soul. Before she could react, the snowman lunged. Mia awoke hours later, the storm finally subsiding. She was lying in the snow outside the farmhouse, surrounded by strange, human-shaped mounds. The house was eerily silent, its windows frosted over. She stumbled to her feet, calling for her parents, but there was no response. When she turned back to the yard, her blood froze. There were 3 new snowmen now, each one eerily lifelike. One wore her mother's scarf, another her father's hat. The third was smaller, with long hair made of twigs. It was wearing her coat. Mia screamed, the sound swallowed by the cold, empty fields. She ran toward the road, but as she looked back one last time, she saw them move. The snowmen weren't watching the house anymore. They were watching her. December was supposed to be a time for family, warmth, and holiday cheer. But for Liam, it marked the 1-year anniversary of his older brother, Caleb's death. Struggling to deal with the loss, Liam's parents decided a change of scenery might help the family heal. They rented a secluded cabin deep in the woods, far away from the bustling city and the painful reminders of Caleb's absence. The cabin was quaint and cozy, surrounded by towering evergreens and blanketed in pristine snow. But as soon as they arrived, Liam felt uneasy. There was something off about the place, something he couldn't quite put into words. The first night was restless. The wind howled through the trees, and the old wooden beams creaked and groaned. At around 2 a.m., Liam woke to the sound of faint whispers. He sat up, heart racing, and looked around the small room he was sharing with his younger sister, Lily. She was fast asleep, her soft snores the only sound in the room. The whispers seemed to come from outside. Against his better judgment, Liam crept to the window and peered into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing but the snow-covered forest. Then, in the faint moonlight, he spotted a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was too far away to make out any details, but Liam could swear it was watching him. The next morning, Liam tried to brush off the strange encounter as a bad dream, but as the day wore on, the sense of unease grew stronger. The whispers returned that afternoon while the family was gathered in the living room. Liam was reading a book by the fireplace when he heard it again, a soft, barely audible murmur, like someone speaking just out of earshot. He looked around, but his parents and Lily didn't seem to notice anything. Later, While exploring the woods with Lily, they stumbled upon an old, dilapidated structure. It was a small shed, its wooden walls weathered and partially collapsed. Curiosity got the better of them, and they peeked inside. The interior was empty except for a single chair in the center of the room. Carved into the walls were strange symbols and words in a language Liam didn't recognize. As they stepped closer, the air grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder this time. Lily grabbed Liam's arm. "We should go," she said, her voice trembling. Liam didn't argue. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences intensified. The whispers became more frequent, and objects in the cabin started moving on their own. A chair that was tucked neatly under the table would be found pulled out, as if someone had been sitting there. The old clock on the wall would chime at odd hours, even though it wasn't working. One night, Liam woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. He got up to investigate, thinking it might be his dad getting a midnight snack. But when he opened the door, the hallway was empty. The footsteps, however, didn't stop. They echoed through the cabin, growing louder and faster. Liam's parents dismissed his concerns, blaming the old cabin's creaky floors and drafty windows. But Lily believed him. She admitted she'd been hearing the whispers too, and sometimes, late at night, she felt like someone was standing at the foot of her bed watching her. Determined to figure out what was going on, Liam decided to do some research. He found an old newspaper in the cabin's small bookshelf, and one headline immediately caught his eye. "Family vanishes in isolated cabin. Only clues left behind are cryptic messages." The article described a chilling tale of a family who had rented the cabin decades ago. They were last seen by a neighbor before a snowstorm cut off access to the area. When search parties arrived weeks later, the family was gone, leaving behind strange carvings on the walls and whispers that locals claimed to hear at night. Liam's heart sank when he read the last line. Some believe the family never left, but became part of the forest, their voices forever trapped in the winter wind. Later that evening, Liam and Lily revisited the shed. This time they brought flashlights. Inside, they found more carvings on the floor, arranged in a circular pattern. At the center was a faint handprint, too large to belong to either of them. Suddenly, the door slammed shut. The whispers erupted into a deafening cacophony, swirling around them. Liam grabbed Lily's hand, and they bolted back to the cabin, their flashlights flickering as if the batteries were drained. That night, the cabin came alive with activity. The whispers grew into voices, frantic and angry, and the walls seemed to vibrate with an unseen force. The temperature inside plummeted, and frost crept along the windows. Liam and Lily tried to convince their parents to leave, but as they packed their bags, the front door refused to open. It was as if the cabin itself wouldn't let them go. The voices grew louder, and shadows began to move across the walls. One by one, the lights in the cabin went out, plunging them into darkness. Liam lit a lantern, but its flickering light only made the shadows seem more menacing. Then, the figure appeared. It stood in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. Its form was human-like, but its features were obscured, as if shrouded in smoke. "Leave," it whispered, its voice echoing with unnatural distortion. "We're trying!" Liam shouted, clutching Lily's hand. The figure raised an arm, pointing toward the shed. "Go back to where it began." With no other choice, the family braved the freezing night and returned to the shed. The wind howled around them, and the whispers seemed to follow their every step. Inside, the carvings on the floor began to glow faintly, illuminating the handprint in the center. The figure appeared again, standing outside the shed. "Finish it," it said. Liam, trembling, placed his hand over the print. The whispers stopped instantly, replaced by an eerie silence. The air grew warmer, and the figure dissolved into the snow. The family left the cabin the next morning, never looking back. Even now, years later, Liam avoids the woods during winter. He knows the whispers are still there, waiting for someone else to hear their call. December in the small town of Silver Pines was a magical time. The streets were lined with twinkling lights, and the air was filled with the scent of pine and gingerbread. For Alice, a recent transplant to the town, this was supposed to be a fresh start. She had rented an old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, hoping the quiet would help her focus on her writing career. The first few weeks were peaceful, with the occasional visit from neighbors, dropping off baked goods or holiday greetings. But one evening, just as Alice was settling down with a cup of tea, she heard singing outside. It was a caroler, a man's deep, melodic voice echoing through the still night. Intrigued, Alice opened the door, expecting to find a group of singers. Instead, there was only one man, dressed in an old-fashioned coat and top hat, holding a lantern. "Good evening, miss," he said with a bow. "May I sing for you?" Alice smiled awkwardly, unsure how to respond. Sure." The man began to sing a haunting rendition of "God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen." His voice was beautiful, but something about the way he stared at her made Alice's skin crawl. When he finished, she clapped politely. "Thank you," she said. "Would you like some hot cocoa, or—" But the man was gone. The next day, Alice mentioned the caroler to her neighbor, Mrs. Whitaker, an elderly woman who had lived in Silver Pines her whole life. "A caroler?" Mrs. Whitaker frowned. "That's strange. No one's done door-to-door caroling here in years." Alice brushed it off as a quirky small-town tradition, but that night the caroler returned. This time, he didn't wait for her to open the door. His singing started around midnight, the same eerie song floating through the air. Peeking through the curtains, Alice saw him standing in her yard, the lantern casting long shadows across the snow. His face was partially obscured, but his presence felt oppressive. She locked all the doors and tried to go back to bed, but the singing didn't stop until dawn. Over the next few nights, the caroler's appearances became more frequent and invasive. He no longer stayed outside. Alice would wake to the sound of his voice inside the house, the mournful hymn echoing through the halls. One night, she found wet footprints leading from the front door to the living room, even though the door was still locked. Another time, she discovered her record player spinning, even though she hadn't touched it. Desperate for answers, Alice asked around town about the mysterious caroler. Most people shrugged it off, but one man at the library mentioned a local legend. "Years ago, there was a caroler named Thomas Grayson," he said. "He was famous for his voice, but he disappeared one Christmas Eve during a blizzard. Some say his spirit still roams the town, singing for those who are willing to listen." Alice's heart sank. Was this some kind of prank? Or was she truly dealing with something supernatural? Determined to put an end to the torment, Alice began researching Thomas Grayson. She learned that he had been a beloved figure in Silver Pines, known for his charity work and love of Christmas. But on the night of his disappearance, rumors swirled about a terrible betrayal. The town's wealthy mayor had allegedly cheated Thomas out of a large sum of money. Enraged, Thomas had confronted him, and the two had a heated argument. The next morning, Thomas was gone, and his body was never found. Alice discovered an old photograph of Thomas in a town history book. Her blood ran cold when she recognized the face. It was the same man who had been singing outside her house. The more she dug, the more she realized the connection. Her house had once belonged to the mayor's family. The final straw came on Christmas Eve. Alice was wrapping gifts when the singing started again, louder than ever. This time, the caroler was inside the house, his voice echoing through the walls. The lights flickered, and the temperature plummeted. Alice grabbed a flashlight and followed the sound to the basement. The caroler was standing in the center of the room, his lantern glowing faintly. His eyes locked onto Alice's, and for the first time, he spoke. "You live in his house," he said, his voice a mixture of sorrow and anger. "Do you know what he did to me?" Alice shook her head, too terrified to speak. "I never got justice," Thomas said, "but I will have peace, if you help me." The lantern's glow intensified, and Alice saw the outline of a trap door beneath his feet. With trembling hands, she pried it open, revealing a shallow grave. Inside was a skeleton, clutching a blood-stained Christmas ornament. The moment the grave was uncovered, the caroler vanished. The air grew warmer, and the oppressive feeling lifted. Alice called the authorities, who confirmed the remains belonged to Thomas Grayson. His story made headlines, and the town mourned the tragic end of one of its most beloved figures. On Christmas morning, as Alice sipped her coffee by the fire, she heard a faint, distant voice singing "Silent Night." She smiled, knowing Thomas had finally found peace. But every December, when the first snow falls, Alice can't help but glance out her window, half expecting to see the caroler standing there, lantern in hand, singing just for her.